Okay, welcome to this Quill training session. Today, our focus is going to be on archives and resource collections, which are becoming an increasingly important aspect of Quill's offering alongside our negotiation models. I'm afraid this is a bit of a mammoth session, so just to let you know where we're going today. First of all, we're going to look at what we mean by archives and resource collections. Then we're going to think about how to go about assembling the material for a resource collection. Thirdly, Annabelle's going to look at how to catalogue the material you want to use in the resource collection and how to enter it into Quill. If you've got any questions after the presentation, do get in touch with the documentary editor in charge of your project. So to start us off and make sure we all know what we're talking about, we thought we should begin with a couple of definitions. First of all, what is an archive? The International Council of Archives defines archives as follows. Archives are the documentary byproduct of human activity retained for their long-term value. They are contemporary records created by individuals and organisations as they go about their business, and therefore provide a direct window on past events. They can come in a wide range of formats, including written, photographic, moving image, sound, digital, and analogue. Archives are held by public and private institutions and individuals around the world. You can see from this definition that archives are all around us. If your mum has a box of photos and drawings from your elementary school days, that's an archive. However, examples that are more likely to be of interest to us are a box of letters between two members of a constitutional convention, or committee papers from a convention held in a state archive. Finally, it's also worth noting that we use the term archive more loosely to refer to the physical location where archives are held, for example, the Library of Congress or the National Archives of Ireland. So you might well hear someone saying, I'm going to visit the archive. Then secondly, what is a resource collection? This one's a Quill word, and for our purposes, resource collections are curated digital collections of archival material related to the projects we're modelling in Quill. I say they're curated because our collections are selections of material. The degree of curation will vary a bit from collection to collection, but to take the example of the Northern Ireland Peace Process, we've been able to digitise archival material donated to Bowdoin College by Senator George Mitchell. Bowdoin has a large volume of material relating to his very long career in US politics. We are only interested in what might be called a subfonds or a subsection of his papers, those relating to Ireland. And even then, we've not been able to digitise everything because of copyright and personal data restrictions. So what is presented in Quill is an edited collection of material that we consider to be useful in interpreting Senator Mitchell's role in the peace process. Our resource collections can either be curated collections of images of archival material hosted in Quill, as you can see here in this slide, or they can take the form of links to images hosted outside the platform. In either case, they're curated collections of primary source material related to our models in Quill. So why do we need resource collections? I've already hinted at the fact that primary sources for some projects are already available online. So can't we just piggyback those other collections? First of all, it's important to say that we can and we do piggyback other online collections. For example, the papers put online by the Library of Congress. However, where possible, we want to house as many of our collections on Quill. There are a number of reasons for doing so. First of all, it enables better research. Quill models are based on primary source material, and all that material should be in Quill. We want to make it as easy as possible for users to check our interpretations and modelling while staying on the platform. Our objective is to build tools for research, not just an academic article with footnotes. By creating resource collections and linking them to the model, we ensure that the primary source material and the hard work and research we conducted to locate those resources are fully integrated into the model. Secondly, housing the material in Quill enables better resources and tools. More data about the primary sources in the Quill database means more options for exploiting it and creating resources for users. For example, we can create commentary collections and other features around resources if they're created in Quill. and transcriptions stored in Quill are searchable, enabling richer search results for users. Thirdly, better resources mean more users. User feedback and user stats on the website strongly indicate that users love resource collections and the convenience of having primary sources in one place. Many first-time users come to the platform for the resource collections and then discover the models later. But creating resource collections isn't just for the benefit of other people. It also makes life easier for us. We're working as a team, and as you know, there are a lot of checks that take place in the data entry in the models. When someone else is checking your work, it's much easier if they can immediately see in Quill the resource items you've relied on for that session. It will also be easier for you when you come back after a break to pick up where you left off. And it means that the transcriptions should be available in Quill before you start modelling, making the modelling task easier. For all these reasons, start by locating the primary sources and creating the resource collections when you're about to begin a new project. And when you're ready to start modelling, the first thing you should do when you create a new session is to attach the primary source to the session. We've now got a short video to take you on a tour of the resource collections and how to attach items from them to the sessions.
We're starting on the Quill library page, which should be familiar to you all. This is one place where your resource collection will appear once your lead editor has created it for you. So, for example, if I scroll down past the resource collections tab here, this is one of the resource collections that we've created for the Writing Peace project on Northern Ireland. It includes a range of documents from the National Archives of the UK. Starting on the Quill library page. However, there is also an easier way to find the resource collections you'll be working with on a day-to-day basis. If you go to the full record view of the negotiation that you're working on and scroll down past the source material, delegations, and committees, you can view the resource collections associated with the negotiation and click through that way. If your resource collection has not yet been associated and does not appear here, you can use the Edit menu to attach the resource collection to the negotiation. When you click View Collection, you will be taken to a page where you can see a series of boxes, which might be organised into different categories. Think of this as if you were in the archive. There will be a lot of boxes full of documents, all of which have unique identifying numbers or names, and which might be grouped together into different structures. You can click View Box Items to open the box and see all the documents inside it. Once you click on an item, you will be taken to this page, where you are viewing a resource item directly. This is the name we give to your archival scan once it is uploaded to Quill with all of its associated metadata. The resource item will have a unique identifying number and jump code, just like all the events, sessions, committees, and negotiations in Quill. You can find that here. On the left-hand side, you can scroll down through the items in the box you currently have open and use the navigation tools to view lists of documents in other boxes, or to open those other boxes to view and explore those items. There are also other tools that researchers can use to explore and compare different documents, tools which are currently under further development. For example, if you wanted to compare this draft of the Joint Declaration to a later version, also in the box, you could find that by searching titles within the box, or you could click Split View to see the two documents side by side. On the right-hand side, you can see a list of all the sessions that this document has been used to model. Clicking on one of the links will take you to that session. Part of your job as student editors will be creating these associations as you model to help researchers find the source material they need and understand how it relates to the model. to link a resource item to a particular session, open the Edit menu in the top right-hand corner, click Attach this item to session, and then select the negotiation and the session ID that you want to attach the item to. You can also type in the number here. The digital nature of the archive collection opens up further new opportunities. If we go back to the landing page of the resource collection, for example, and then click Show All Items, we are able to search the titles of all the items within the collection, while still seeing which box they belong to and what position they have within it via these little metadata tags. This is what you'll be helping to create.
Now that we've established what a resource collection is, the question is how we can make a good one. Starting positions will vary. So you might be cataloguing a donated archive from scratch and going on to create a digital collection, as we did with Monica McWilliams' papers that you can see in the picture. Or you might be scanning files which have already been catalogued and are housed in another archive. Or you might be working from an archive that has already been digitized somewhere else online. We're not going to address the first issue here. If you end up being in that position, we would recommend that you hire an archivist to oversee the process. The second two types of collection you will almost certainly encounter in most of Quilp's projects. We're going to start with walking you through the process of collecting the files yourself in an archive. Hopefully some of you will be doing that, but even if you don't, it highlights a process that has already taken place in other online collections and that you need to be aware of as you build resource collections using material digitized by other people. As we go about creating digital collections, we need to respect three core archival principles: respect des fonds, preserving the integrity of collections; provenance, ensuring it is clear where an item has come from; and original order, ensuring we preserve information about the order and context that documents were located in. We're not going to go into archival theory and practice in any depth here, but let's just consider some of the implications for these principles in our work as Quill editors. So first of all, records from different archival collections should not be mixed. As you might know, we work in Tolkien's office here in Oxford. So if you forgive a Lord of the Rings analogy, imagine you're modelling the Council of Elrond. Don't create a Council of Elrond collection and mix together in the same collection material that you've gathered from the archives of the hobbits, the elves, the men and the dwarves. Instead, create a Council of Elrond library, and within that library create at least 4 different collections: one for the hobbits, one for the elves, one for the men and one for the dwarves. Secondly, we need to structure our collections so that the user knows exactly where a document has come from. If, having looked at the document in Quill, the user decides that they want to see the original document for some reason, it should be immediately clear which archive it comes from and which box within the archive. The user should know where they need to go and what they need to call up in that archive in order to look at the physical document. Thirdly, hierarchy within the original archive should be maintained. So our users should be able to understand a document's context in the wider collection and draw conclusions about what it was co-located with. For example, there might be a covering note explaining a document that will affect how it should be interpreted. Fourthly, supplementary and contextual information about the document should be available for our end user. We want to replicate for the user as closely as possible the experience of seeing the document in the physical archive box. We're not trying to pull a fast one on the end user based on a particular interpretation of a thin shred of evidence, like tabloid journalists or politicians on the campaign trail. We want to show all our workings and ensure that they are open to detailed scrutiny. These principles need to be consciously and intentionally adhered to in all the collections we create, whether those are based on online material or sources we've gathered ourselves. The application might be slightly different at times, but the principles remain the same. So, let's assume you're going to create a resource collection by visiting a traditional archival institution and scanning documents related to the convention you're working on. Perhaps you already have a printed journal for the convention online, but you believe the local state archive has further information and committee papers. A good resource collection begins with careful planning and assembling of the resources. So let's think through how you're going to go about that. Before we go any further, I just want to make a disclaimer. We've made many of the mistakes we will highlight along the way. Sometimes we've gathered archival material without the idea that a resource collection was going to be the outcome. Sometimes an academic has come along and offered us scans, and we've taken them and haven't had the time or the resources to go back to the original archive and acquire the additional material. We have to do what we can with the material available and decide whether or not it's suitable to use. But today, we want to think about being intentional and following best practice as we create a resource collection. I'm afraid the next screens are quite text intense, but we wanted you to have a checklist that you can go back to. So, first of all, some practical reminders as you plan a visit to the archive. 1. Do your background research in the archive. Do you need to book in advance and order documents before you get there? Should the archive be informed of your visit? Does the archive permit users to take images of their collection? Do they have a published policy on publishing such images? It's important that you have all this information before you get there. It would be a bit of a disaster if you arrive there and discover you're not allowed to photograph images, for example. Secondly, check the catalogue. Know what you're looking for. Create a list of the files, documents, and boxes you hope to look at. Arrange a team briefing and assign files to different team members to ensure maximum efficiency during your visit. Thirdly, prioritize the files and have backups. It's very hard to predict what you will find when you get there if you've not visited an archive before. In some archives, a document means a folder with perhaps 200 pages. In others, it's literally a single page. Next, training. Ensure that everyone visiting the archive is registered with the archive if necessary and has taken any online training that the archive offers. It might sound blindingly obvious, but read all the information available from the archive preparing for your visit, as local practice will vary. You will look silly if you ask questions that were clearly answered in the booking acknowledgement email, for example. Equipment. An overhead scanner that saves its outputs to the clouds is the ideal piece of equipment, but relatively few archives allow you to bring your own scanner. So if this is not possible, we recommend that you use a smartphone with a good quality camera and download a scanning app. Then practice using it. We recommend the Microsoft Lens scanning app for 3 reasons that I will return to. But in summary, firstly, it should be possible to upload images straight to the cloud, which will avoid them being locked away on lots of different devices or you running out of space on your phone in the day. Secondly, it's easier to preserve the order of the images. And thirdly, you can save the images straight to PDF, which is a format required for upload to Quill. If you take, say, 1,000 images over the course of a day in the archives, and each one of those has to be converted to PDF later, that's a lot of additional hours work. Obviously, for some projects, perhaps if you're working with particularly beautiful manuscript material, you may also want some high-resolution image files. If this is the case, we would still recommend doing the bulk of your scanning with Microsoft Lens and then taking supplementary images using a camera. Next, storage. Think about whether you can upload your scans directly to a cloud store. Do you need to do anything in advance to arrange Wi-Fi access? And finally, a couple of obvious points. Make sure that you have chargers and cables. And if you're a team lead, assume nothing and bring spares for everybody else as well. Back at the beginning, we summarized the core principles: respect du fond, provenance, and original order that we want to adhere to in our collections. Let's think about how those apply when we visit an archive to make scans. First, and most importantly, when you leave the archive, you need to know exactly where every scan came from, which box, which section of the box, and the order in which you find the documents. Do not rely on your memory for this. In the moment, you think you will remember what you found and where you found it. Believe me, you will not remember. You might have great intentions to organise your scans that evening as soon as you get home. But when you get home, your flatmate has flooded the kitchen. You come down with glandular fever, and when you get back to work, your boss decides that you need to be seconded to another team for a month. I exaggerate, but even if you do sit down and look through your scans the same evening, 1,000 documents later, it is very hard to remember what order or boxes things were in unless you have already organised your scanning as you go. So, before you even set off for the archives, create folders on your file share or hard drive that match the exact names of the documents, files, boxes in the catalogue of the archive you're visiting. As you scan, save your files straight to the correct box. Ideally, these folders should be on a shared university system that your team lead also has access to. This avoids any problem with getting them transferred later, especially in the flood, glandular fever, and secondment scenario. The hierarchy of the online files you create should match that of the archive. Returning to my Council of Elrond library, if I visit the Elves archives, they might have separate boxes for Elrond and Legolas. Each box might have been subdivided into correspondence, minutes of meetings, photographs. My online file hierarchy should reflect the same subdivisions so that I can save files to the correct place and replicate the structure when I create the collection in Quill. Now that you are in the archive and ready to start scanning, a few tips. First, scan the cover of the box folder. The cover will usually have the folder name and code, so this is a good backup to ensure you have a record of what you were scanning. Then scan each folder or box, whatever the relevant subdivision is in this particular archive, as a single file. It's quicker and safer to scan the contents of each folder as a single file with the cover of the box as the first page and split them later. It ensures you bring back with you the full context of the documents, and it makes it much easier to recreate what you found. Follow a principle of more, not less. How much you scan will depend on the project and time available, but bear in mind that we don't always know what is relevant until much later, and even if it isn't immediately needed for our modelling purposes, a document may provide useful context, add colour, or be interesting for researchers visiting our site. From our experience, the quickest method is often to scan the entire folder. It ensures documents are in the context without having to write lots of notes. It's often quicker to scan than to read and make a judgment. Maintain original order. Sometimes the file will be too large to scan as one document. If this is the case, ensure you number the different files you save to your online folder so you know what order they appear in. Microsoft Lens only allows you to have 100 pages in a single document, and from painful experience, I'd suggest you stop scanning and start a new document before you hit the limit. Then write notes. Especially if you haven't scanned the whole box for some reason, you need to write notes about what else was in the box. I find it's useful to have a notebook and pencil and to write a note about why I've moved on and left out a section. Then I scan my notebook in between the document scans so that I have a record in the right place in the file. Again, that means that if I end up just handing my scanning over to someone else, it will be clear to them what I was doing and why. Sometimes you order up a box in the archive and nothing in it is relevant for some reason. If you scan nothing in a box, write a brief note explaining what the folder was so that project staff and future interns know that it's been consulted. Otherwise, there's a risk that it's going to be called up again on a future archive trip unnecessarily. So, to summarize, when you leave the archive, you should have your scans saved in folders that mirror exactly the physical collections. Anyone else coming along should be able to identify exactly where each document came from. If you didn't go back to the office, could someone pick up from where you left off? But sometimes we don't need to fly to Washington, DC or Dublin or get the train to London because all the documents we need have been wonderfully digitized by someone else. In many ways, this is a godsend. It saves lots of money for our projects, and it saves time and effort transporting people around and scanning boxes of documents. However, you should not see this as a get-out-of-jail-free card, if you have that expression in America. How useful and easy to use these collections are will depend a bit on how well the work you're relying on applied the core principles when they created the collections. You save work in some areas, but you have different research to undertake before you can incorporate them into your model. There are two key questions that you need to ask when using online collections. These are also questions you need to ask about material you scan yourself, but by and large, the situation is a lot clearer when you're working with physical archives in an archive. The first question is this a primary source or a secondary source? As you probably know from your own studies, this is a key consideration. If we want the modelling we're doing on Quill to be authoritative, we need to go back to the original source or as close to it as we can possibly get. The secondary source will definitely help us to get there, but we want to build the core model on the foundational documents, and we want to provide those documents as evidence in our resource collections. Don't get me wrong, secondary sources are great. As a project team, you should be keeping a list of the secondary sources that you consult so that you can create a bibliography for each convention at the end of the project and acknowledge those sources. I don't want you to go away from today saying that they told us not to use edited volumes. We should use them. We stand on the shoulders of giants in some cases, and we should cite them giving full references in editor's notes if we rely on them. But we should also test them and make sure that we compare what they have with the primary text. Particularly when it comes to building the document text in your model, amendments to the text should be relying on a contemporary source, not a secondary source. If you can't get back to a primary source, then a conversation needs to take place around that with the academic leads and the project director before you decide what to do. I'm not an expert in finding error America, but Dr. Cole has assured us for the projects that you're working on, it should be possible to get back to primary sources. If you've made a genuine effort to find a primary source and can't, then do let your documentary editor know, and we'll see what we can do. But honestly, that detective work of trying to piece together the evidence and find the source material you need is part of the fun of research, so embrace it. So how can you tell if it's a primary or a secondary source? These questions are not definitive, but they're good indicators. Are you seeing an image of a manuscript document of some kind? Or are you seeing a transcription with an annotation? Perhaps there might be a citation with information about where the document came from that will help. On this slide, you can see an image of a manuscript of a letter, which is clearly a primary source. And then you can see an image taken from an edited edition, where someone has transcribed a primary source and made their own annotations to it. So that was the first question. Is this a primary or a secondary source? The second question you need to ask, particularly around material you find online, is whether you're allowed to reproduce the image and text that you've just found. Just because you can see and download a document doesn't mean that anyone else will be able to see it. It could be behind a paywall, for example, that you have access to through your university sign-on. And even if you can access it, it doesn't mean you're allowed to use it in another website. Hopefully there will be helpful guidance on the site you're using about whether you can use the images you're looking at or not. Sometimes it will clearly state that it is open source material and can be reproduced and what citation you need to give, in which case you're good to go. Just make sure you fully and prominently acknowledge the site that you're using and that you do so in the way that they've requested. Copyright is another good reason for going back to the primary sources. as they are much less likely to be copyrighted, especially in 18th and 19th century projects. If you've got back far enough to be looking at a picture of the manuscript, you will at the very least be able to make your own transcription and use that in these projects. Although archives and third-party sites can't copyright the text of the original source, the archive that you're consulting may have retained rights to the image. If this is the case, then think about whether it's worth contacting the archive, or whether you will have to display a link to the image rather than the image itself. If it turns out that you aren't allowed to download the image of the manuscript and upload it to Quill, you can create the resource collection using just links. It will display something like this. So in this screen, we see the link displaying to an image which is hosted on a third-party site. In the next page, we see a similar a link to the same description. This is the same image, but this time the image itself is hosted in Quill. Even if you can't display the image live in the internet, we would encourage you to keep a copy of it, but indicate that it cannot be displayed for copyright reasons. The reason we ask you to do this is that we have experience from other projects of the links going offline. It can be helpful in relocating the document to have an image of it. And if for some reason the whole website we're linking to disappears, it will be good to have copies of the images stored ourselves. If you're taking an image from another site, albeit with their permission, or because they've indicated it's free to reproduce, please be good citizens. Ensure you enter any citations they have requested and display any logos or other acknowledgements. Please also include a link so that users can visit the other site and check out what they've done too. Think about the papers you've scanned in the state archives in Illinois or somewhere else. We make our collections freely available, but we would like a little acknowledgement if they've been used elsewhere. These links and citations become an important part of provenance in collections based on other digital collections. So, to summarise, consider the core principles of respect des fonds, provenance, and original order as you create your collections, whether they're collections of curated images from an archive or links to another online collection. Secondly, ensure you collect all the relevant metadata for each item. Again, this is the case whether you're creating a collection of images or of links. If you're creating a collection of links and the website you're linking to goes offline and you have stored no metadata or transcriptions, it will be impossible to know what you were linking to previously. And finally, follow the same approach to attach the resource items to the sessions in your model, whether you're attaching an image of an archival material that's hosted in Quill, or if you're using a link to an external source. Annabelle's now going to talk you through the next phase of the process.
So the next phase of the process might happen either when you get back to the office from the archive, or once you've identified the online collections and the specific documents within them that you will need to create as resource collections in order to model your negotiation. Simply put, you need to first ensure that you have well-organized collections of documents, then collect and record a series of metadata, and finally upload those documents and their associated metadata to Quill. Why do I say documents rather than links? As Ruth has already emphasized, it is important that wherever possible you download the images of the documents in question. Even if these cannot be displayed publicly in Quill, they may become a critical resource for you guys and for future documentary editors if the site the links index is remodeled or taken down. However, where it is not possible to download documents, you will need an organized collection of links that reflect how the documents are structured within the collections you are indexing. The key question to ask yourself is whether someone who is new to the project could use your resources to build a collection without having to repeat your research. So the first question some of you might be asking yourselves is, what is metadata anyway? On the simplest level, metadata kind of just does what it says on the tin. It's data about data that we record that describes or gives us information concerning other data.
What does that mean specifically for Quill and for us all as documentary editors? In this case, the metadata we record is a set of around 20 fields, the exact number varies by project, which provide important contextual information about the documents you have scanned or located. The choice of these particular metadata fields wasn't an arbitrary decision. They're based on a set of common standards devised by the International Council on Archives, known as the ISADG, or the General Standard of Archival Description. They don't follow these guidelines word for word, since we are not digital archivists indexing our own collections, but they do reflect the common standards set out there. This relates to our earlier point about being part of a larger Quill community. It is important that the archivists that we are trying to build relationships with see that all of us at Quill are respectful of core archival principles and have thought about how to apply those principles to our own collections, even though we are not a conventional digital archive. How do we use metadata? Firstly, and most importantly, we use metadata to ensure that we're respecting the core archival principles that Ruth mentioned earlier. Just to remind you all quickly, these are respect des fonds, provenance, and original order. The metadata that you record will give us a detailed picture of where exactly the document was when you found it in the archive, and will allow us to recreate that information for the end user in Quill. Secondly, we can also use this metadata to add value to the collections. There are certain advantages to a digital platform which allow us to do things with the scans that can't be done with the physical documents. Generally speaking, the three key ways in which the metadata allows us to add value are by searching the documents, filtering the documents, and resorting the documents. For example, perhaps you're a researcher and you want to look for documents from a particular month, or only see items that pertain to a particular keyword. Perhaps you're a documentary editor and you want to see all of the items in the collection in chronological order to figure out where to start your modelling. With the resource collections, you should be able to do any of those things. However, it is also important to emphasize that these two uses are in harmony with each other rather than in conflict. We are continuing to work on ways of maintaining users' awareness of archival hierarchy and context, whilst also helping them view the documents in different and more accessible ways. One example of that is the little metadata tags that you saw at the end of the video earlier. There are two main ways that metadata can be recorded on Quill projects, either in a spreadsheet or via the Quill Add a Resource Item form. Your lead editor on the project will tell you whether you're to use one or both of these methods when creating a particular resource collection. Before we discuss the metadata fields, I just want to make a quick point about the spreadsheet. There are two cardinal rules of spreadsheeting where you are using one. They're unfortunately both very boring, but they're also very important. If you remember them, it will make your life and the lives of your colleagues and collaborators a lot easier later on. Rule number 1, make sure all the cells are set to text, especially the date fields. If the data is stored as a date, that date will open on some people's computers in an American format, on other people's computers in a UK format. Some of them will have the year as 4 characters, some will have it as 2. Some will randomly start replacing months with words. And it will only take this happening once to turn all of the data in the column into a useless string of numbers in someone else's spreadsheet. Your collaborative spreadsheet might be a Google Doc, so I've also got a little image of how to set cells to text on Google Docs in the top right-hand corner of this slide, just in case anyone needs a refresher. Rule number 2, don't add spaces to the end of any cell. This is particularly important for the box name and the file name. In some ways, computers are very silly. If you put a space at the end of the name of the box/folder, Quill will assume that you wanted to create 2 boxes, one called box 1 and one called box 1 space. If you put a space in the file name, either in the spreadsheet or as you save the file, the two will not match, and then the spreadsheet can no longer be used to edit metadata or to upload files. The diagram on the left shows an archive tree. To reiterate, it is very important that you come back from the archive with an organized system of folders, as on the right-hand side, and that you understand how your folders map onto the archive tree of the archive you have visited. That tree might not look exactly the same as this example. Smaller archives might not include subfonts or subseries, for example. And since you're unlikely to be aiming to scan the whole archive, your folder structure will not encompass the entire tree. But what is critical is that you cannot skip stages. Even if you only scanned papers from one file within a subseries, make a folder for that file and name it correctly. For each item, I should be able to trace it back through all the different levels of the hierarchy right back to the fonts, just from looking at your folders, without any explanation or contextual material. When you come back from the archive, you will, ideally, as Ruth recommended, have complete scans of each folder, including the cover. One of the first things you will need to do is to split these scans up into individual documents, which should all be saved within these folders in the format name of box/folder _ item number. This is essential because it means that the document always carries its position within the physical archive with it, which makes it much harder to lose that information. If you accidentally lose metadata like the date of a document or the author of a document, that information can be double-checked from the scan and re-entered. But if we lose the information about which box a physical document was stored in, or its position within that box, you would have to go back to the archive to check that, which probably isn't very viable. I would also suggest that you duplicate your original scan of the complete file before you start splitting it up and renaming the individual documents. This means that you'll have a backup to check the position information against, just in case you make any errors with the numbering. Now I'm going to take you through the metadata fields, one by one. For each field, I'm going to describe what information you will use it to record, how you will record that information in Quill and in the spreadsheet, and how that metadata will appear to an end user of Quill. A lot of this is fairly straightforward, but it does mean that you'll be getting a lot of information all in one go, so apologies for that in advance. You will also have a copy of this PowerPoint to refer back to, so don't feel you have to try and write everything down. I'm going to follow the structure of the Quill input form, which is laid out in thematic sections. You can also click back and forth between the sections if that better suits your workflow. The spreadsheet is laid out slightly differently, but records almost exactly the same information. For each field, I will also indicate where it appears on the spreadsheet and explain any small differences in the way the information is recorded there. The first section of the form is content type. There are three options here for content type: upload a file, external link, and text input. In 99% of cases, the correct option here will be upload a file. And in the rare cases that it isn't, you will have been explicitly told so by your lead editor and given supplementary instructions on how to use the other formats. The file you upload should be a PDF file. It is also possible sometimes to upload other kinds of file if necessary, but you should always check with your lead editor first. You will not be able to upload multiple files for one resource item, so you need to make sure you've got a continuous PDF. If you're recording the metadata in a spreadsheet, you will not have to select the content type, but you will need to type in the file name into this column here. As I mentioned earlier, the file names should all be in the format name of box/folder _ item number. You should record the file name exactly as it is within your folder, but do remove the file extension, so the .pdf, from the end. Make sure there is not an extra space at the end of the field. If you edit the file name in the spreadsheet, you will have to edit it in the folder and vice versa. Matching this field to the file name allows Quill to correctly attach all the other metadata when running a spreadsheet mass upload or a spreadsheet mass edit. So if you enter a different name here or they get out of sync, the upload will not work. The other field you will see on this tab is the document subtype field. This is a list of options which will have been customized for your project by your lead editor. If you're unsure which option to choose for a particular document, do check with them. You will only be able to select one option here, so do consider the needs of the end user. For example, in Ireland, we often get a lot of letters that record meetings. It's more helpful for us to have these marked as record of a meeting rather than correspondence, since the latter format is simply because someone is sending the record of the meeting to another person. This will also be a drop-down menu for you in the spreadsheet to avoid any extra spaces or typos creeping in. The second tab of the upload form is item details. The first of these fields is the title of the document. For each resource collection, the UVU team leads and the Pembroke lead editor will have worked together to develop a list of project-specific conventions for titling the documents and referring to particular delegates, organisations, etc. You will need to make sure that you're familiar with these conventions and that you follow them in titling the documents. The next field is item description. This metadata field will appear under the title in Quill. It is a free text field where you will give a brief description of the contents and physical features of the document you're working on. You should write in full sentences rather than bullet points. You can briefly contextualize the item if necessary. For example, if you know that it is the third draft that they are discussing, mention that. But do not give your personal assessment of the document or use personal pronouns in this field. Ultimately, you should think of an item description like a catalogue entry. Does your description give the end user enough information to allow them to decide whether or not to click on the link and/or read the document all the way through? If your resource collection is a journal or the debates, the description you write here will be very similar or perhaps even identical to the session description in Quill. This means you will save yourself a lot of work later if you take care with these item descriptions. Those principles are all a little bit abstract, so I've included some concrete examples here of the sort of thing you should be aiming for. These descriptions are written in full sentences using the correct tenses. The first example is the kind of description you might be writing for a journal entry, which could then also be used for the session description in Quill. It's fairly brief, but it still gives the user specific information about the events of the session. If you were reading this description as a researcher, you would know whether you wanted to click on the document or the session. The second example is a description you might write for something you brought back from the archive. It notes that the document is handwritten, and it adds contextual information to help the user understand what they are looking at, without giving the editor's personal opinion on the document. Here we have some examples of things not to do. The first description here begins with a personal judgment. Whilst you might, for example, note that a photocopy is very faded, it is not very scholarly to declare a handwritten document illegible. And as I said before, you should not use personal pronouns in this field. In the second example, all the sentences begin with the delegates, which is overly repetitive. In the third example, the present tense has been used to describe events which took place during the session. Finally, and most importantly, all of these examples are much too vague. They do not tell us which specific documents were being debated or amended, and they give no indication of the contents of those documents or of the amendments to them. The next field is length in scanned pages. This is pretty self-explanatory. You just need to give the number of scanned pages in the file. This field isn't visible to users in Quill, except insofar as they can obviously see how many pages there are in the PDF. But it's more of an internal audit field that allows us to check whether any digital pages have been lost in the process of cataloguing. Length physical sheets will only appear on the form and the spreadsheet if necessary, and it probably won't be necessary very often for your projects. We only use it when we are cataloguing somebody's papers ourselves, as it is important to record the number of physical sheets of paper in a collection to preserve the papers against loss or theft. But if they are in the care of an archive, that is their responsibility rather than yours. The date of document creation is the date field that appears below the title in Quill. If you're working on a journal collection, this will be the date the journal was published. It can also be used for filtering and sorting documents. You should input the date that the document was created. So if it is the minute of a meeting that happened on the 24th of February, but the minute was written on the 26th, put the 26th. In the Quill upload form, you will have a pop-up that lets you see the calendar and choose the date that way. However, the spreadsheet upload system is set up for UK dates, so please put the date in the UK format that you can see also on the slide. If you don't know the date, or you don't know elements of the date, replace the characters that you don't know with question marks, as in the example. You can also use your editorial judgment and independent research skills to narrow down dates where they aren't explicitly given. For example, you could look up the date of a newspaper article or infer that a letter was written on the 30th of November if they refer to a meeting on the 31st as being tomorrow. The date of meeting or event or enclosure is a supplementary date field. If you're working on a journal convention, this will usually be the day the convention met. We use it to record important dates that aren't necessarily the date on which the document was created. For a meeting between two heads of state, for example, the first briefing document might be written months in advance of the meeting, but it would still be a useful document for someone researching the meeting. You can also use it to record the date of an enclosure or another date that is a useful point of reference for the document. That being said, you can also repeat the date of document creation here where they do coincide. If someone is searching for documents relating to a particular meeting, it's helpful if they only have to search by one field to get all the relevant documents and not have to use a second filter for documents that date from the day of the meeting. The author field is fairly self-explanatory again. You need to tell us which individual or individuals wrote the text of the document. You will need to make sure that you follow the standards set by your team lead for referring to them. You don't want to end up with George Washington, Washington, and the President all appearing as separate authors in your resource collection. Where the author is a delegate in Quill with a person ID, make sure that you use the first name and the surname exactly as already recorded in Quill. Where there is more than one author, if you're using the spreadsheet, please separate them with a semicolon and enter unknown if you're not sure. The author affiliation field records the organisation that the authors in the previous field are affiliated with. This might be a government, a political party, a newspaper, or a corporation of some kind. You may need to record more than one affiliation for one person. This is useful for people who might be tackling broader questions in their research, tracking the influence or legislative output of particular groups rather than of specific delegates. It also avoids us mixing up individual delegates and political parties within one authorship category. As with the author field, it's very important to avoid people referring to the same groups in different ways. So please consult your lead editor and/or your team lead to familiarise yourself with the way that particular groups and organisations should be referred to within the collection. For the keywords field, you will select appropriate keywords as agreed between your lead editor and the UVU team leads. These will appear as suggestions, which you can then click in the box on the upload form. The options you select will be visible in Quill as tags on each document, as you can see on the slide, and will also be used to search for and filter the documents within a collection. Some documents will have many keywords associated with them, whilst others will have none or hardly any, and that's fine. After all, some documents are more important than others. If you find yourself using a keyword for every single document, it is probably worth asking yourself whether the keyword is too broad or whether you are using it too broadly. But on the other hand, if you're cataloguing a folder titled Rules of Order and you have a rules keyword, you might expect to be using that for every document. It's really a question of continuing to communicate amongst yourselves and with your lead editor to make sure that you're all using the keywords in a similar way and that you continue to feel they're useful and appropriate. If you feel there's an important one missing as you go along, you can always make a case for it to your team lead and they can raise it with your lead editor. In the spreadsheet, you will have to type the keywords yourself in this column. Be very careful not to include typos here and separate them again with semicolons. The next section of the form deals with third-party information and legal status. One important caveat here is that you must establish your right to use the text of a document before you start creating a resource collection or using the document to model things in Quill. If the text of a document is under copyright, you will be able to use it to make inferences or to cite for particular facts, but you will not be able to use the text in the description field. Even if most of the material you work with was created more than 120 years ago, it isn't always as simple as you might think, as Ruth was saying earlier. Some examples of this include taking uncopyrighted material from a copyrighted source. For example, if you can only find a letter by Thomas Jefferson in an edition compiled and annotated by someone else, or an edited volume which puts the journal and the debates side by side. If the material has been selected and arranged by another researcher, you may not be able to use the text as you would usually use a copy of the journal or debates. These are issues that will be discussed between the team leads and the senior editor before any resource collections are created. The copyright status field uses a traffic light system to note the copyright of the images for each resource item. This is a really important field, and filling it in is a good way of making sure that you are aware of the copyright status of any material that you're using in the model. Use green to indicate that you're 100% certain that we have the right to publish the image. Use amber to indicate either that you're unsure whether we have the right to publish the image, or that you don't think we currently have the right, but that it could be secured, or is in the process of being secured by your lead editor. Red should be used in cases where we definitely do not have the right to display the image. Users' abilities to see the images in Quill will be restricted accordingly according to their permissions. If you select amber or red in the Quill upload form, you will need to explain why you selected that option in the text box below. This is an opportunity to flag any issues with the material for review. In the spreadsheet, you just need to type red, amber, or green into the field, and it will automatically highlight the cell to make checking the status of items easier. Data protection works in a similar way to copyright, but it is another field that won't be relevant for most of your projects. We use it for projects like Writing Peace that deal with recent material to ensure that we are not publishing sensitive information or personal details, such as home addresses and personal phone numbers, on Quill. If this field is appearing on the upload or edit forms for your collection and you don't think it should be, please get in touch with your lead editor. The next field in this section is copyright information. The obvious question is, how is this different from the copyright status field? The copyright status is a traffic light system that restricts what metadata the end user can see. This field, instead, displays a message to the end user which explains the copyright status of the item to them. Why is this field necessary? Firstly, certain kinds of license, like the Open Government license, in this instance on the slide, require a link to that license to be displayed alongside the material. Secondly, it allows us to flag something which has a different copyright status from the rest of the collection, or to note if we have been given specific rights to reproduce something which is under copyright. Thirdly, it is another way to acknowledge the archives that we collaborate with and which have kindly given us permission to use images of their collections. This field will be pre-populated by your lead editor, and they may also provide you with a list of appropriate alternatives for different documents within the collection. However, if you think none of the messages are suitable for the item you are cataloguing, you should flag that with your team lead or lead editor through the Quill tasks system. It's a field where it's difficult to cover all eventualities. You should only populate the related link field if you are creating a collection with documents that you've downloaded or sourced from another digital collection. The link will display in Quill either instead of an image or alongside it. We need these links to be reliable, so wherever the option is available to you, you should choose a DOI or a permalink. And where images are available on more than one site, you should consider whether that site provides DOIs or permalinks as one criterion in deciding which site to use. This is especially important if you do not have permission to display the images in a collection. When you're writing the display text for a link, make sure to give the user context, but also to keep the message brief. see the example on the slide. The next tab is Linked Model and Groupings. The linked model information allows you to link items to particular negotiations or committees within Quill. In the upload form, you have the option here to select either negotiation or committee, and then pick the correct option from the drop-down menu. You can only attach the item to one negotiation or committee. Choose the committee you think is most appropriate, or if the document is equally relevant to a variety of committees, attach it to the negotiation instead. In the spreadsheet, there will be two separate columns for this field. In the first column, linked model type, you need to enter either committee or negotiation. In the second column, you will need to enter the ID number for the committee or negotiation. To find this, remove the letter from the start of the jump code and simply enter the number. So for this example from the slide, I would write committee in the first column and 2689 in the second column. Item position controls the order that items appear in within a particular box. As Ruth emphasised earlier, it is very important that we ensure that documents appear in Quill in the same order within a box as they do in the physical archive. In both the spreadsheet and the Quill upload form, you will need to remember to think like a computer. One example of this is using 01 to 09 when more than 10 documents appear in a box, or 001 to 099 when more than 100 appear. Sometimes an archive may assign item numbers to its documents themselves. This means that if you split up documents they consider to be one item, you may have to start using 18A and 18B, for example. Exact issues will vary by collection, of course, but I guess what I want to emphasize here is that this can be harder than it looks. Your lead editor will help you understand how to number the documents in your particular collection. The groupings fields are used to organize the way that documents are presented in Quill. They assign the documents to boxes and group particular items or boxes together. This means that these fields, along with the item position field, are particularly crucial since they allow us to follow that principle of original order and replicate the hierarchy of the physical archive. The question of exactly how your files map onto the Quill metadata fields will be a question to be discussed between the UVU team leads and the lead editor on the project. Based on this discussion, the lead editor will then set up groupings for your resource collection. On this tab of the upload form, you will see the top-level groupings for the collection. Double-click down through the hierarchy until you reach the box or subdivision that your items belongs to, and then select it. This video is just a quick example from one of the Writing Piece collections. In the spreadsheet, you will not have to input all of the layers of hierarchy. You will always need an entry for the column labelled name of box/folder, but your lead editor or your team lead will tell you whether or not you need to fill in the fields for category and/or subdivision. The next tab on the form is the transcription tab. This only exists in Quill and is not in the spreadsheet. If you want to save Microsoft Word copies of your transcriptions for backup, that's fine, but please make sure that you're initially entering the transcriptions in Quill rather than in Word so that you don't copy across formatting that you don't want. Similarly, when you start modelling, it is very important that you only copy and paste document text from the transcription field in Quill and not from Microsoft Word. This is really important, and problems can occur even if you can't see visible formatting differences in the Word output. For example, we've had issues previously with the background colour being set to white, hidden page breaks, and spacing between lines. It is also crucial at this point to make sure that the text of the transcription in the transcription field is 100% accurate and has been very, very carefully proofread, especially if you're using an OCR to generate an initial version. Once the text starts getting copied and pasted into different documents in Quill, the number of times you have to correct any mistakes will multiply quickly. And as you all know, once any error becomes part of the document text in Quill, it is a very complicated and time-consuming process to correct it. When you're writing a transcription, you need to make sure that you're copying the document exactly as it appears in the image. This means retaining the spelling errors and intentional formatting that you find in the original document. I'm sure most of you know this already, but just to reiterate that intentional formatting means you should not include arbitrary things like line breaks or page numbers, but you should include things like underlining, use of bold, italics, etc. Make sure not to correct or alter any grammatical errors, typos, or archaisms that are present in the original, and do not use sic in this field. The final section of the form is labelled Advanced Options. If you can see this section of the form, please don't tick or write anything in here. These fields are for senior editorial use only. I'll hand back over to Ruth now for a final summary of how this newer work on resource collections should shape your approach to future projects.
Thank you for joining our training session today. Just to summarise some of our key points again. First of all, map out source material and resource collections before you begin work in a project. Our research and modelling should be built on a secure foundation of verified sources, so all projects must start here. Once you've reviewed the source material available to you, meet with your designated documentary editor to talk through your findings and plans and agree customization options for your resource collections. Thirdly, plan archive visits as early as possible in the process so that the material you collect informs the model and is fully integrated. And finally, please attach documents to each session before you start to model. Following this practice will make everyone's life much easier, and it reminds us to be intentional and conscientious in thinking through the evidence on which we're basing our modelling. Thanks again for joining us today.